Hello, world, and welcome into the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 44. This week's show is going to kick off with a little slice of Cape Cod history as I share the story of the original Cape Cod Canal bridges, not the ones that we see today, Sagamore and Bourne, but the ones that were there when the canal first opened. We're going to go way back in the day as I get all excited to tell you about Tecmo Super Bowl for the Nintendo Entertainment System and all the fun times I had playing that. There's another stop on the road trip as we stop into Lynchburg, Virginia. We're going to have a brand new top 5. This will be my top 5 favorite Maine towns, so that's a good one to get some travel tips on. There's going to be a brand new This Week in History and Time Capsule, all of that and more on episode 44 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in, everybody. It's more of a normal week this week, thankfully, after last week when we had the huge storm that knocked out power for when I recorded the podcast. I'm so happy that it's mundane and normal now, power, and everything seems back to its regular ways. And also, thankfully, the storm didn't take down all the leaves, so there's still some foliage around. That was another thing I was worried about, is not getting out there to get any beautiful foliage on Cape Cod shots. Because when you think of foliage, I would think most of you think about northern New England, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. But Cape Cod gets a lot on its own. It's just usually later in the season, around this time, mid-November. I'm a big fan of the foliage stuff. I don't know if you are, if you think it's overrated, that people go crazy, the leaf peepers. I love November, not just because it's my birthday month, which just passed last week, but my mother's birthday's coming up. It'll be a few days after this podcast goes live. Then my sister Kate, her birthday is a few weeks after that. Naturally, we got Thanksgiving, so there's a lot of celebrations and family stuff, and that gets more important as the years go by. Thanksgiving back when I was a kid was just an excuse to eat and eat and eat, and now, yeah, the food's still great, but it's more important to spend the time with the people that mean the most to you, especially when you get older, and those days kind of get fewer and further between. The one thing I think we can all agree on, though, is that the ending of the daylight savings time and turning the clock back, that's just the worst thing about November. It signifies that winter's coming, which winter is fine. Like the first snow of the year is usually nice unless it's a blizzard. But then after that, it's just cold and dreary and everything is barren. But yeah, now that the sunset, so when this goes live on November 11th, the sunset is at 4:24. Oh my God, it's terrible. And I just went to check to see, to really make it depressing, when the earliest sunset of the year is. And we're looking at the first week of December. Basically, the sunset gets down to 4:10, but then it starts to go back up. But, oh, man, it's just rough. But no matter the weather or the sunset times or whatever, I keep coming through with the podcast. Hopefully you've enjoyed the first year. Now we're in year 2, and this is episode 44, so it's the second episode of year 2, but I'm not going to renumber the episodes. I'm too lazy. Thank you to everyone who has been tuning in, and hopefully I keep the content fun and interesting. And here's one that I think is interesting, and I'll try to make it as interesting for you. Let's kick off episode 44 with the story of the original Cape Cod Canal bridges right now on episode 44 of the In My Footsteps podcast. On July 24th, 1914, the Cape Cod Canal was opened after construction had begun 5 years earlier on June 19th, 1909. It opened as a privately operated toll waterway and connected Cape Cod Bay to Buzzards Bay. The canal shortened the distance needed to bypass around Cape Cod immensely. After that, the peninsula that was known as Cape Cod, once the canal had been completed, it became a man-made island. And naturally, being an island, there was a need for bridges to cross the canals. So the canal was originally 100 feet wide. It was expanded to its current 480-foot width in 1935, but there were bridges needed to drive across the canal. In 1910, the Buzzards Bay Railroad Bridge became the first to be constructed with the first Bourne Bridge coming a year later in 1911 and the Sagamore Bridge becoming the third, and it was completed in 1913. Those two vehicle bridges, Sagamore and Bourne, they consisted of two 80-foot cantilever spans. These are long, projecting beams fixed at one end. So yeah, the original Bourne and Sagamore bridges were drawbridges, electronically operated, which when opened provided a 140-foot navigational clearance for boats to pass through. The drawbridges would prove to be a hassle for mariners, though. The swift current of the canal proved dangerous for the vessels trying to wait for the drawbridges to be opened. After officially opening the canal, the problems with the bridges and current caused fear amongst the mariners, leading to an underwhelming number of vehicles passing through the canal in its first few years. It was like people would rather keep going around the Cape than go through the canal and risk smashing into the sides waiting for the drawbridge. So initially, the Cape Cod Canal was deemed a failure. During World War I, the canal was taken over by the Federal Railroad Administration under the orders of President Woodrow Wilson. Despite it being returned to the control of original owner August Belmont after the war, it became apparent that there needed to be at least some improvements made to the bridges over the canal. In 1928, the United States Army Corps of Engineers took over the operation of the Cape Cod Canal, thanks to the authority of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1927. The canal was improved, widened, and deepened. Despite those improvements to the actual waterway, the biggest improvements came through the construction of 3 entirely new bridges. The new Bourne and Sagamore bridges would be fixed structures rather than the drawbridges. They also would have an elevation of 135 feet above the mean water level, which was a stark increase from the 41-foot clearance underneath the original drawbridges when they were closed. 2 new bridges were built simultaneously, beginning in 1933, thanks in part to the Industrial Recovery Act of that same year. It was trying to help get businesses going more as the Great Depression started to take hold. They would be located in close proximity to the original bridges and opened for business on June 21st, 1935. The original railroad bridge would also be replaced. Construction began in December 1933, with the new railroad bridge opening September 20th, 1935. The bridge at the time was the longest vertical lift railroad bridge in the world at 544 feet in length. That was eventually topped by the Arthur Kill vertical lift bridge, which connected Elizabethport, New Jersey to Staten Island, New York. That one was built in 1959, and it's 558 feet in length. The 3 current Cape Cod Canal bridges have been helping people cross the waterway for more than 80 years now, and it's easy to believe that they were always there. However, if one looks, they can actually find the remnants of the original Bourne and Sagamore bridges. For the Bourne Bridge, one can cross over the canal, get off immediately at the first exit, and go about 3/4 of a mile down Route 28, and there you'll find the appropriately named Old Bridge Road. You follow it to the end and get out onto the bike trail of the canal. You go to the right, and there is one of the drawbridge approaches. It looks like just a giant 20-foot tall concrete slab. It's got a painting on it, like a mural of what the bridge used to look like. And that's pretty cool because it brings it to life, what used to be there. And then on the other end of the canal, on the Cape side, you go out onto the bike trail on the canal, but on the Cape side, and it's roughly about light pole number 115. They're all numbered along the canal. I guess it helps if there's any trouble with people getting hurt or lost or boats. If there's any damage, you can kind of judge by the light pole to where emergency crews have to go. But there is where you'll find a similar giant concrete slab for where the Sagamore drawbridge was located. And this one is topped by an A-frame house, which is on Pleasant Street in Bourne. Those original drawbridge abutments, the concrete, they're fun to find. It's like being a detective, and it's a connection to the past. I mean, those things opened over 100 years ago, and you can find photos, too. There's a website I go to a lot when I'm doing blog posts for the In My Footsteps podcast blog. It's called digitalcommonwealth.org, and it's run by the Boston Public Library. It's thousands and thousands of historic photos and documents from the state of Massachusetts. And if you look up Sagamore Bridge or Bourne Bridge, you're going to find a lot of these old drawbridge photos. It's wild to see how different they looked and to think that that was what originally crossed the canal. I think they even have photos of shipwrecks where the boats that were waiting for the drawbridge crashed into the rocks on the side. And of course, when it comes to the canal and the current Sagamore and Bourne bridges, there's always construction going on with those, which especially like if they do it in summer, it just kills traffic, slows it down. So the question is always around of when those bridges are going to be replaced. Because think about it, they're coming up on 100 years that they've been opened. So I'm sure at some point, maybe in my lifetime, maybe in your lifetime, they will replace the canal bridges a second time. But until then, we've got the old Sagamore and Bourne bridges still going. Part of me wishes we had drawbridges, though. I would love to go back and see what those were like. But for those of you that had never heard the story of the original Cape Cod Canal bridges, there you go. A little trip back in time, over 100 years to the original canal bridges, the problems that went with them, and their eventual replacement. All right, this is the next installment of the 2019 road trip. After the last two, the Blue Ridge Parkway being a fail and Appomattox, Virginia being a semi-fail, this one is more normal. The next stop on the road trip was the city of Lynchburg, Virginia. It's basically right next door to Appomattox, Virginia, which is why it was convenient to stop there. It's 115 miles west of Richmond, and with a population of just over 80,000 in 2019, it was one of the biggest cities that I stopped at. I tried intentionally to not stop at big cities on this trip. So if you've been following and you know my loop that I took out through upstate New York, Pennsylvania, and south, I easily had chances to go through New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. They were all right there, but I chose to go to the smaller ones, mid-sized ones, because that interested me more. Lynchburg is definitely quintessential Virginia. It's got the foliage like many places do this time of year, but it's also got that industrial heartbeat underneath. It dates back to John Lynch and his first ferry crossing of the James River in 1757. And that's another interesting thing is the James River that crosses through it. For those of you that have been listening to the podcast, you heard it at the beginning. The song that I use for the theme is called James River by a man named DJ Williams. I always put the links to his website and his albums in there, and it's an awesome song. But the James River that it's named for goes through Lynchburg. Lynchburg is very much a walkable city. They've got 40 miles of urban trails, the downtown riverfront area, and they've got one of the things that I love about a lot of different cities and towns, and that's a historic Main Street. On Cape Cod, we've got Chatham and Falmouth and Hyannis have pretty nice main streets, so I'm a big fan of those. Lynchburg's got the same thing. They've got a mix of history and modern amenities with trendy boutiques and lofts and local cafes and a new craft brewery. But then you've got landmarks from a century ago, like the iconic Beaux Arts Theater, the Grand Virginian Hotel, which have all been restored to make them look like they're brand new, but they're from over a century ago. If you're strolling along Main Street, one of the places you've got to visit is the Lynchburg Community Market, which has been open since 1783. It's actually one of the nation's oldest markets located in downtown Lynchburg. Back in the 19th century, when it was on Water Street, it served more as a town square, an open-air market. People would just go and meet there. It's been enlarged and rebuilt several times, but today, after many of the changes in the building style and location, the community market and armory stands on the corner of Main and 12th Streets. And that area, the downtown area, Main Street, it's got that neat little throwback feel with cigar shops and Gentleman John's classic barber shop. Even if you're not into that or you're not looking for that when you get to Lynchburg, it's hard not to get immersed and kind of just lose yourself in the atmosphere. After you're done strolling the town or wandering Main Street or going to the community market, you can grab a drink at Star Hill on Maine. They're located at 1300 Main Street and also starhill.com. And it is the second oldest craft brewery in Virginia. The most popular drink in there is the specially made Main Street IPA. So you can stop in there for a drink, but if you want something to eat, there's a lot of restaurants in the area. If you're looking for a classic, typical sports bar, they got the Main Street Sports Bar and Grill at 1125 Main Street, or also mainstgrillva.com. They got pizza at Benny Scarpetta's. You got sushi at Aji Ramen and Sushi. And they got incredible rolled ice cream at Rolled Cold Creamery on 819 Main Street and rolledcoldcreamery.com. If you've never had it, it's literally what it sounds like, rolled ice cream. It's wild. It's something that you've got to try at least once. If you're looking for more culture, you can visit the Academy Center of the Arts. It's a historic theater which plays host to 5 resident companies. They got opera, chorus, symphony, ballet, and theater. They bring in people from Broadway shows. And it's got a neat history because it was opened in 1905, but then for 60 years it was closed before it was reopened in 2018 after a $30 million renovation. Check out what they've got coming up at academycenter.org, and then go visit them if you're down in Lynchburg at 600 Main Street. So you've checked out Lynchburg, you've grabbed something to eat, maybe a drink at one of the breweries, you've taken a walk around the riverfront, you've gone to see some culture, gone to take in a show. Now you got to find a place to stay to spend the night because you got to take more than one day there. I would recommend booking your stay at the Lynchburg Grand Hotel. That's at 601 Main Street and also at lynchburggrandhotel.com. But of course, make up your own mind when you go down to Lynchburg or you go to any of these places on my road trips. I always just give suggestions and recommendations based on my tastes and my likes, and yours may be different. So that's why it's always better to kind of get an overall scope, an overall view on your own. So visit lynchburgvirginia.org. They've got everything you could possibly need to book your stay and find places to go, things to do, things to eat and drink. And you're so close to a lot of different things. Like I said, the Blue Ridge Parkway goes near there. Appomattox, Virginia is close to there. Richmond isn't that far away. And I hope you've enjoyed these road trip segments so far from this 6-day, 2,100-mile road trip that I did now 2 years ago, basically this month. I've still got several more places to share and I got a lot that I'm excited about to share. So tune in again next week on episode 45 when the next road trip will be historic Jamestown, Virginia. But before then, check out Lynchburg. And now every time you hear James River to begin or end the podcast, you can think about going to Lynchburg because that's where James River is from, and you can take your own road trip. November is here. It's the month that has Thanksgiving in it, and there's so much to be thankful for. Health, friends, family, but it's also the birth month of the creator, owner, CEO of Wear Your Wish, Katie Marks. Katie has worked so hard on her clothing, accessory, apparel line, and so much more. There's always new things to check out at wearyourwishes.com. They've got new boho t-shirts. Check out the double layer feather anklet in the jewelry. There's so much more there for bracelets, for t-shirts, sweatshirts. There's fashions for all ages, all genders, all times of year, for gifts for yourself. All of it high quality merchandise created with love straight from the mind of Katie Marks. Anything from jogger sweatpants to tote bags to tabletop fountains, and there's always new stuff coming out. Whatever I mention now for November, there's going to be new stuff coming out in the next weeks. Things for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for New Year's, for spring. It's all there. There's wearable aromatherapy, sacred chakra wellness stone kit. There's things you wouldn't even think of. If you go to wearyourwishes.com and check out the Wear Your Wish brand, you're going to find something you want for yourself or something that you want to give to others. And that is the whole point, giving something wonderful to someone wonderful. And Katie Marks at Wear Your Wish does that. So visit them today, wearyourwishes.com, and find that special something for that special someone. This week in history, we're going back 52 years ago this week to November 10th, 1969, and the debut of probably the most iconic children's television show ever, Sesame Street. Basically, anybody listening to this podcast is familiar with Sesame Street and probably watched it, considering that it's been out for 52 years. But if you're one of the handful that have never heard of it, it's a fictional street with a lot of fictional characters that were the Jim Henson Muppets that kind of got started on there, but there's other characters. You know, Big Bird was the main one. Today's kids got Elmo, but there was Grover and Bert and Ernie and the Count. And they had regular people, human characters as well. And it was all about learning and dealing with situations and growing up. As of the recording of this podcast, there are nearly 4,600 episodes of Sesame Street. Everybody knows the song, Can You Tell Me How to Get to Sesame Street? It was on PBS, and I think it still is on PBS, but in 2016 it moved over to HBO and HBO Max. I think that's like the first run episodes, the new ones. But I believe you could find Sesame Street on PBS probably right now if you pause this and go look. What started out as a simple educational program for kids, it grew into something so much bigger. It's like a cultural phenomenon. They did their live show, Sesame Street Live. If you listen to episode 26 of the podcast where I talked about the Cape Cod Coliseum, you'll know that I said that the only time I ever went to the Coliseum was to see Sesame Street Live in 1982. There have been movies, including Follow That Bird, where Big Bird gets kidnapped. I went and saw that in the theater when I was a kid. God, I was probably 8 years old. There have been more than 180 albums of Sesame Street music. And the people that have written them, there have been 11 Grammy Awards for Sesame Street. And they've got so many toys now based around the show. I mean, God, you remember Tickle Me Elmo? I mean, there you go. That thing was a huge, huge deal up there with Cabbage Patch Dolls. As of 2018, Sesame Street had received 189 Emmy Awards, more than any other show in history. They've got an award-winning website, sesamestreet.org. It's consistently ranked as one of the greatest shows of all time. Not just children's shows, but just the impact that it made. Think about it. You listening to this part right now, you've got your own memories of Sesame Street. Whether it's Big Bird, Snuffy, Oscar the Grouch, Grover, Elmo, Cookie Monster, Kermit the Frog, and so many more. It's hard to imagine a world without Sesame Street. And that all began 52 years ago this week when Sesame Street debuted in 1969. And now it's time for a new time capsule. So this week we're going to go back to that same day that Sesame Street debuted, November 10th, 1969, and give you a little idea of what else was going on in the world of entertainment. The number one song was Wedding Bell Blues by the Fifth Dimension. This was off of their Age of Aquarius album, which I'm sure a lot of you know that song. Just look it up, you'll know that one. The song was originally written by Laura Nyro and was actually covered by Morrissey years later after the Fifth Dimension covered it. The Fifth Dimension version of the song spent 3 weeks at number one. The number one movie was Easy Rider. It starred Jack Nicholson, Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, and more. And this is another, speaking of cultural icons like Sesame Street, Easy Rider, everybody knows. It's a motorcycle road trip movie that became kind of a slice of life, slice of culture of 1969. And it was a huge success. It ended up making more than $60 million on a budget of less than $400,000. When adjusted for inflation, that brings its box office total to about $450 million, so that'll give you a better idea of what a success it was. The number one TV show was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. This was a classic variety show starring Dan Rowan and Dick Martin. It ran for 6 seasons between 1967 and 1973, with a total of 140 episodes. This was one of my youthful Nick at Night pleasures. When they first got Nick at Night around here, I used to watch Laugh-In. It started the careers of a lot of people: Goldie Hawn, Lily Tomlin, Ruth Buzzy, Henry Gibson, Gary Owens. Legend has it that when Richard Nixon appeared on it to do the "Sock It To Me" part, that helped him win the election in 1968. The show definitely comes highly recommended. Just look it up and find any episode, and you'll see if you like it or not, if you like 1960s humor. And if you were a little kid in November 1969, you just got done watching Sesame Street, and you wanted to go play outside and enjoy the day, you could get a gym set, swing set, straight out of the Sears catalog for $49.95, or about $373 when adjusted for inflation. It may not sound familiar, especially to kids from the 1980s and 90s, but it's like the precursor to the classic swing set that you would used to have with the slide, a couple of regular swings, and then that swing that was like a bench, 2 benches put together, and they had the other swing that looked like the flying scooters they had in Star Wars: Return of the Jedi. If you go to christmas.musetechnical.com, there's a picture of it. That's where I found it from. An old Sears catalog, an old beautiful swing set that would probably tip over if you all swung on it at the same time. Those were the good old days. And that's going to wrap up another time capsule, another This Week in History, and it's time right now to dive into a new top 5. This is my top 5 picks for my favorite Maine towns. So let's jump right into that. The term quintessential New England I throw around a lot. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that term. It's just the sights and sounds and attractions and the things to do that just scream New England. It's hard to describe until you're a part of it, whether it's skiing in the north or shellfishing or lobster fishing, long scenic drives, clam chowder, baked beans, all these things that you think of when someone says New England. And for me, there's quintessential New England. There's also the quintessential small towns. And so for me, the towns is what I want to share here with the top 5. And we're going to pick out the state of Maine. It's more than 35,000 square miles. A lot of it is unincorporated, especially way up north. But this here is going to be my list of the top 5 Maine towns. And boy, this was a hard one to narrow down. Remember, as I always say, these go in no particular order. So if you hear one that you like and it's not where you think it should be, these are not going from A to Z. It's just random order. So let's let the arguments begin right now with some honorable mentions for my favorite Maine towns. They include Lubec, Portland, Old Orchard Beach, and Bangor. If any of those are on your top 5 or not on your top 5, or if you're curious about them or any of these, check out visitmaine.com. That's the state's tourism department, and you'll kind of get a better idea of why I love these towns. But here they are, the actual top 5. Number 1 is York. York, Maine is the second town you will enter in Maine after crossing from the New Hampshire border right after Kittery. I could sum it up by saying York, Maine is home to Cape Nettic, also known as Nubble Lighthouse, and say that's enough for me. But it's also home to Long Sands Beach, Mount Agamenticus, York's Wild Kingdom Zoo and Park, and a lot more. Number 2 is the town of Rockland. I fell in love with Rockland when I went up and stayed in neighboring Owl's Head in 2010. It was my first ever real road trip. And naturally, surprise, surprise, it's home to Rockland Breakwater Lighthouse. So there's a lighthouse, so that naturally gets me all jazzed up. Rockland is so awesome, as far as I'm concerned, that my buddy Steve and I actually drove all the way up there for one day to do a photo trip. And for us down on Cape Cod, it's 5 hours to drive up there. So we had to get up at like 3:30 in the morning to head up there. I think we stopped a few places on the way, but we got up to Rockland at like 9:30. But that's how great it is. It's also home to the Farnsworth Art Museum, the Maine Lobster Festival, and a lot more. Number 3 is Bar Harbor. I love this because it's out on Mount Desert Island. It's right next to Acadia National Park. It's got this feeling like you're on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard or one of those islands. I guess it is an island, so that makes sense. The real key to Bar Harbor, though, is Acadia National Park. That's really, I mean, there's so much more hotels and shops and restaurants, but for me, it was Acadia. I mean, Cadillac Mountain, the Thunder Hole, Acadia is incredible. You need a week just for that. That'll be coming up on a road trip segment in the future, just Acadia. But there's a reason why so many cruise ships come into port at Bar Harbor. But I try to keep the segment shorter, the top 5 ones. So go to visitmaine.com and just look up Bar Harbor. You'll see why it's on my top 5 list. So those first 3 are probably places that you've heard of, and all the honorable mentions I think you will have heard of, except for maybe Lubeck. So these last 2 in the top 5 might be a little more obscure, but they're nonetheless just amazing. Number 4 on my top 5 favorite Maine towns is Machias. Machias is another place that I got familiar with on that original 2010 Maine road trip, and I got more familiar with when I went up to Maine in 2019. When you're traveling east along Route 1, once you get past Bar Harbor, you keep going. So when I was going out to Lubeck, which is the furthest east you can go in the state of Maine and the United States, you start to realize just how wide open and how barren the area is. So Machias became like an oasis. It was the last bastion of civilization before you got to Lubeck, which was 45 minutes further east. And it's every bit a small town. There's only a population of just over 2,000, but it's home to the Bold Coast, Bad Little Falls Park, which is pretty neat, Middle River Park, and for me, I loved eating at the Bluebird Ranch family restaurant. That's where I first learned what fiddleheads were. For those of you that don't know, it's a vegetable. It's kind of like asparagus, sorta, but it's neat. It's pretty good. And finally, number 5 on my list of favorite Maine towns. Speaking of small towns, it is the small town of Hallowell. This one may seem out of left field. This one might be the place that you've never heard of. It's a small town just outside of the capital city of Augusta. They have a population of just over 2,400, and it is every bit classic small town America. You can take a walk in the historic Vaughan Woods, grab a drink at the Liberal Cup. You can sit in one of the Adirondack chairs at Granite City Park and just overlook the Kennebec River. You can grab a bite to eat at the Lucky Garden Chinese food restaurant, or just wander the streets and just enjoy what it's like to be in a classic, quintessential New England, small town Maine area. It also doesn't hurt that one of my oldest friends, Shayna, and her husband and their 2 kids live in Hallowell, so that always makes it more fun to go there as well. Maybe I'm a little biased. But that wraps up my top 5. Have you been to any of those places in Maine? Have you been to York or Rockland, Bar Harbor or Machias? Have you been to Hallowell? You should check out all of those and the honorable mentions. Make it a big road trip, and I'll be back next week with another top 5. Oh man, this has been one that I've wanted to talk about for quite a while on the podcast as we go way, way back in the day. And I discuss what was probably my first ever favorite video game. And I'm sure a favorite of a lot of 80s young boys and 90s kids. And that was Tecmo Super Bowl for the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Ready, down, put.
All-time classic. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours playing this game for Nintendo back when it came out in 1991. In 1989, there was the original Tecmo Bowl, which, it was all right. It was a football game. The sequel, though, Tecmo Super Bowl in 1991, was leaps and bounds ahead. I mean, not in terms of, graphics. It was, it's 8-bit for Nintendo. It's nothing like what you see today with PS5 and such. But back in the day when that was all you had, it was amazing. And the big thing was Tecmo, the company that created the game, they got all of the NFL licenses so they could literally have all of the real players on there, which made it so much more realistic. I mean, playing a football game with just no-name people wasn't as much fun. So let's transport ourselves back to 14-year-old me playing Tecmo Super Bowl for the first time. Obviously, I grew up in New England, you know from this podcast. So who did I choose to play as? The New England Patriots? No, they stunk. So 1991, I guess they would have used the 1990 team. The 1990 Patriots team is one of the worst in NFL history. They went 1-15. They were an absolute disgrace. Like I said in episode 39, when I talked about being a 1980s Patriots fan, their games, they were so bad they were blacked out here in the home market. So I always got Giants games or Buffalo Bills games. So naturally, that's who I gravitated towards. The teams were good. If you picked the New York Giants, you had Lawrence Taylor, who was like having a tank ripping through the offensive line. He just would throw guys left and right. No one could stop him except for one. If you weren't Lawrence Taylor and the Giants, there was only one other team that you could be to stand a chance against them, and that was the Los Angeles Raiders with their running back Bo Jackson. If you don't know Bo Jackson, if you're younger, man, you missed out. You need to look him up and find he was one of the greatest athletes in the history of American sports. Literally. Great at football, great at baseball. A terrible hip injury ended his career early. But if you play as him on Tecmo Super Bowl, the guy can just run over 5 guys at once. It was almost unfair if you played as the Raiders. You would just every time do the power sweep or go right up the middle, and Bo Jackson would just crush everybody. So you'd have to be either the Raiders or the Giants to have any chance to win, really, because you had the 2 best players in the game. Some of the funny things I'm remembering about the game was that not everybody that was in the NFL at the time granted the use of their name. So, for example, the Philadelphia Eagles had Randall Cunningham as their quarterback, but he didn't give his name. So he was just QB Eagles. So even though it didn't have Randall Cunningham, it was all the same attributes. So super fast, great running quarterback, way ahead of his time. But he was QB Eagles. There were some great players, though. If you weren't Lawrence Taylor, if you weren't Bo Jackson, they had some great ones. I mean, on defense, Derek Thomas, Mike Singletary, Howie Long, Chris Dolman. Those are legends of Tecmo Super Bowl and the NFL in general. Even Joe Montana was in there before he came out with his own sports talk football, which that'll be in some future episode. I'll cover that one. It was so much fun to play either one player or 2 player, play against friends, and see them get pissed off if you pick the Giants or the Raiders. That would basically be it. You'd always be playing as those teams. Although when I think of Tecmo Super Bowl, mostly I think of my friend Hassan. He and I would play that all the time. And he was a big New York sports fan. So he was, huge into the Knicks and Patrick Ewing, and huge into the Giants and Lawrence Taylor, and the Mets and Darryl Strawberry. You'd play a full season week by week, and you'd amass your stats and get into the playoffs and then go for the actual Super Bowl. We used to play it at his house a lot. He had the game. I think I got my copy after him, but we were playing at his house, and I remember I got called. My mother called his house, told me it was time, I think, to go home and have dinner. And we were literally in the middle. I was watching him play the actual Super Bowl game, and I was so mad because I hadn't seen anyone win the Super Bowl yet, and I had to go home. And I told him, I said, call me if you win. And he did. It wasn't that long after that he called up. I remember he was so excited. We won the Super Bowl. Then I was all excited, 14-year-old me, so excited about Tecmo Super Bowl being beaten. That shows the times there. The game was so much fun. A sports simulation game. There weren't that many back in 1991, 92. And yeah, the music is cheesy, 8-bit sounding music. The graphics aren't great, but that doesn't matter. The gameplay is still pretty fun. The ability to be actual NFL players or have the Pro Bowl mode where you had the all-star team. You'd score touchdowns, and they'd have these cutaway scenes of like someone catching the ball.
Touchdown.
It was so state-of-the-art back 30 years ago. A 16-bit version of Tecmo Super Bowl was released in 1993 for the Sega Genesis and the Super NES. I think I had the Genesis one. And it was the same idea, just better graphics, a few new modes to it. There would be different things like the weather would change for games, so you could get rain or snow, and playing in the snow was fun. You could change up the playbook if you wanted to. And obviously there were different players as the years went on. The game and the series have received such a huge cult following, with the rosters constantly being updated with new college players, even up to now. There's tournaments that they do. At the peak in 2016, there were 26 different Tecmo Super Bowl tournaments, which is wild. It just goes to show the staying power of the game. And even doing this now, I haven't played that game in 25 years, but I immediately can think of players that were great back then in the game. I mean, besides the ones I mentioned, Bo Jackson and LT, but guys like Christian Okoye from the Chiefs or Dalton Hilliard from the Saints. I literally hadn't thought of those guys' names in decades, and just researching and going back over Tecmo Super Bowl, I just remember playing as them. And sure, I'd play as the Patriots every now and then. They had Andre Tippett, Irving Fryer, and they still had Steve Grogan, I think. But man, that team wasn't good. If you wanted to win on Tecmo Super Bowl, you needed to be the Raiders or the Giants. But looking back, Tecmo Super Bowl was a game that changed sports video games. It put more emphasis and eyes on NFL players that you might not have heard of, especially back in the day when you didn't have streaming and you didn't just get any game you want at any time. And although you could probably get a copy now, or you could probably get it for the PC where it's hacked and you've got today's rosters in it, nothing beats the original, the 1991 game, because it just blew everyone's mind. If you were a teenage boy back then playing Nintendo and Tecmo Super Bowl, it was like nothing we'd seen. I played it hundreds and hundreds of hours, even if every now and then I had to blow on the cartridge to get it to start, or I had to start all over because I forgot to save it and someone stomped on the floor and the cartridge shot up out of the Nintendo. Oh my God, those were the worst times. Lose your game right in the middle. Did any of you out there play Tecmo Super Bowl? Are you my age, kids of the 80s? Did you play it? Have you ever heard of it? If not, go check it out. I bet you could find it on the PC even to play one of the emulator games. Those were definitely some good old days. I miss those days playing with a son, Tecmo Super Bowl, getting mad if he was the Giants and Lawrence Taylor. I definitely grew up in a great time to be a kid, for sure. That's going to do it. That'll wrap up episode 44 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who checks it out every week. Thank you so much to those that maybe this is the first episode you've ever heard. Thank you for giving it a shot. I do my best each week to come up with interesting topics to share with you. Hopefully you find them interesting and you share the podcast with people you know. That's how we grow this thing. More eyes and ears on it means the longer I can keep going with this. Make sure to find me on Instagram and check out the weekly live streams. I call them Without a Map. Fridays at 8. Hopefully there'll be no more power outages, which makes it where it's almost every other week something happens where I don't do the live stream. Also find me on Twitter. Go become a fan of my Facebook page, the In My Footsteps podcast page. Find the blog. It's all in my footsteps. I tried to make it real easy to find me. If you find me in one, you find me in them all. Interestingly, this podcast will go live on November 11th, 11/11. So make sure you go to visit Wear Your Wish at wearyourwishes.com. I know I had the ad in there, but the fact that it's 11/11 when this podcast will go live, it was just too much of a coincidence that I couldn't miss mentioning that. And as I mentioned in the Lynchburg road trip part, go to djwilliams.com. He's got albums, tons of great music. That's where I found James River, which the song is awesome. I have it on my actual iPod playlist, if that's a thing anymore. If you want to buy me a coffee, you can go to buymeacoffee.com, donate, support the podcast, find the In My Footsteps podcast there. Any donations go to advertising the podcast because that's what I'm looking to do. Increase visibility for this creative work I do. If at any point you have any questions about the podcast or about topics or things like that, shoot me a message, Instagram or Twitter, ChristopherSetterland@gmail.com. I keep saying I want to do a Q&A segment, but, things happen where I forget, and here I am at the end of the podcast this week, and it's like, oh yeah, I probably should mention that in case people want to do that. I wanted to send a special birthday shout-out to my mom, Laurie. Her birthday will come after this podcast goes live, and next week's episode will have a special time capsule for her birth date, but I wanted to make sure I gave her a shout, and I hope you enjoyed your present that you got because you'll probably have it in your hand as you're listening to this, hopefully. But I love you very much, and I hope that you had a great birthday and you got a lot of special messages from a lot of special people because we in the family, we all come from you. All of us kids, all the grandkids, we're here because of you. And the hits will just keep on coming next week with episode 45 of the podcast. Like I just mentioned, my mom will get a special time capsule for her birthday. There's going to be a new road trip, like I said, to historic Jamestown, Virginia. I'm going to share the story of another all-time Cape Cod icon, and that is the Cape Cod Melody Tent. There'll be a new top 5 with the top 5 disco-era bands. And I'm going to go way, way back in the day, 30 years, to look back at U2's Achtung Baby album, which I think is one of the best albums, at least of my lifetime, and I'll tell you why. So it's going to be a very music-heavy episode next week. I'm excited about that. I wanted to make sure that I took a minute to give my condolences to the friends and family of legendary Red Sox player and commentator Jerry Remy. He passed away on October 30th. I found out about it on Halloween, but I was out on kind of an expedition, and last week's podcast had already been recorded. But he battled lung cancer so many times and beat it so many times. And it's just a sad end. He was too young at 68, with his birthday actually would have just passed on November 8th. But growing up, especially during the time when the Red Sox were just getting good and starting to sniff the World Series, there was nothing better than watching a baseball game with Jerry Remy and Don Orsillo calling it. Because even when the game was boring or slow or a blowout, just the banter between those two it was incredible. We who grew up in this area have been so lucky with our sports commentators, especially back then. Remy and Orsillo, Tommy Heinsohn and Mike Gorman, Gil Santos and Bob Cousy, Fred Cusick, Sean Grandy and Cedric Maxwell, Scott Zolak and Bob Sosi, all those guys. It's amazing. But I wanted to give my condolences to Jerry Remy's family and friends. He will be missed. And until next week, remember, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and enjoy every moment you can on this journey that we call life, because you never know when the next sunset is the last sunset. So take advantage of every second we've got breathing this air on this beautiful planet. Thank you all again for tuning into episode 44. I'll be back next week. Until then, have a great week, a great weekend, and I will talk to you all again soon.